Good evening, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, which we've entitled A Robot Walks into a Bar, Storytelling in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, with our very special guest, Dennis Yi Tenen. Now, of course, at MarketingKind, we're particularly interested in the stories that shape society. But arguably, with the arrival of generative AI, we're now at a very important inflection point in the evolution of storytelling itself. But what can a better understanding of how machines have come to generate narrative tell us about the likely impact of AI on the future of our own human story? Well, we're in particularly interesting company to find out because Dennis is both, on the one hand, a professor of literature and a co-director of the Center for Comparative Media at Columbia University, but he's also a long-term affiliate of the Data Science Institute, a fellow of the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society, and a former Microsoft engineer whose code still runs on personal computers all around the world. I first came across Dennis when I read a glowing review of his latest book in the Financial Times. The book is intriguingly called Literary Theory for Robots: How Computers Learned to Write, and I have since enjoyed both the printed version and the audiobook version, which is actually the first audiobook I've listened to where it is written by a male author and narrated by a female actor, which is quite
Oh,
interesting. So welcome to MarketingKind, Dennis. How are you feeling today?
yeah, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor.
I thought that, before we dive into your book, which of course we'll do shortly, I wondered if we could actually dive a little bit into your own backstory. One of our members often gives the career advice that it's really useful to be good at two different things. And I suppose statistically, it's not easy to be the world's best unicyclist. It's not easy to be the world's best
Right.
accordion player. But if you really wanted to be the world's best unicycling accordion player, you could probably pull it off. Now, your
Yeah.
background is two much more valuable things than those. It's narrative and technology. But often, people don't have strength in both of those backgrounds. So how did you come to have such expertise in technology and narrative?
Right, right. This reminds me, I think Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, that was his advice at the commencement at Harvard some years ago. And he said, yeah, I was like a fairly mediocre artist and a fairly mediocre storyteller, but I was like the only person who could do both draw well and tell stories and be funny. So do two things. But I wish I had a sort of a story that makes sense. And I wish I could tell you, I planned it all along. 20 years ago, I had a plan and I executed it. But it's as usual, it's not how life works. Is that, my education was always in comparative literature. And my family moved to the United States in the 90s. And I come from the Soviet sort of educational school, which really privileges literature and philosophy, partly out of necessity, because um, sociology, anthropology, sorry, not philosophy, I meant to say philology, but
Mm.
philosophy, kind of more social sciencey stuff, was just not really well developed in that culture. And so my education was always in literary studies, in philology. I went as an undergraduate. I had a degree in comparative literature, but that doesn't really pay the bills. And so to put myself through school, I always was doing programming. Initially, I was developing sites for cell phones, for like tiny little Nokia cell phones. It's something that nobody wanted to do at the time. And so when I graduated as an undergraduate, I had this weird experience of designing for mobile devices at a time where smartphones were just being invented, and so that means I got hired pretty quickly into the Windows Media group, which was thinking about how to put internet and television stuff like that. So I had kind of a career, a separate career in that. But at the same time, intellectually, I was rooted in literary theory, basically. And so when I went back to graduate school, I really didn't think the two worlds connect very well. And of course it turns out that they do, and I think that's the argument I'm trying to lay out in the book, that now in retrospect I wish I sort of more cogently connected those things, but it wasn't very planned at all, I have to admit.
It's interesting you talk about the Soviet educational priorities and curricula.
Mm,
Here in recent years, there's been a strong emphasis in academia in attracting people into the STEM subjects, science, technology,
mm,
engineering, and mathematics. And of course, the importance of technology today, and as you say, paying the bills, that kind of makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, I wonder, do you think that to a degree that has come at the expense of the humanities, and there's been a decline in interest in the humanities? Is that fair enough, or are there ways in
um,
which a narrative understanding is even more important than
mm.
ever in today's world?
So I think undoubtedly there has been a decline in humanities enrollment across, in all universities. At Columbia, where I am right now, it's slightly different, but maybe it doesn't even matter why. But we have a core program. Point is, we have a very healthy sense of the humanities here, and people come here for the humanities in part. But here's what I will say is that I am a great believer in convergence and kind of in the fact that fields ultimately converge and it doesn't make sense to me today to make a hard distinction between sort of hard and soft sciences or the humanities and the sciences. I think it's also clear that, especially in the history of computer science, is that as we are addressing kind of the low-hanging fruit, the easy targets. So, for example, the easy targets for language generation is creating a grammatically correct sentence. Like that was basically cracked in the 60s.
Hmm.
But so once you address the engineering challenges at that lower level, can we create a sentence? Can we create a paragraph? Can we create a story? We begin to reach engineering problems that are now resemble problems in the humanities. Can we create a compelling story? Can we create a funny joke? So you can teach a computer to tell a joke because or to write sentences, but can you write beautiful sentences? Can you tell funny jokes? And all of a sudden, an engineer is confronted with the question of what is funny? What is beautiful? Think about somebody who is designing interfaces for, I don't know, Facebook, right? So initially you're making buttons, you're making sure things work fast, making things quicker, making things cheaper, making things more extensive. That's a typical, that once you address that, all of a sudden in making of a Facebook, you have to start thinking, how do people communicate with each other? What does it mean to be a family, online? How do we share pictures? And all of those kind of questions, they're no longer, you can clearly recognize them as not engineering questions. They're questions about culture, they're questions about history, they're questions about the humanities. And so I think we are in a moment now when we reach a certain saturation where the easy technical problems are solved, we have engineers who are hungry to kind of go to that next level of addressing social, cultural, political, human kind of problems that are messy and that are not easily automated.
I wonder to what degree this kind of reflects itself in the kinds of conversations that you have. I mean, you talk about convergence. I would love to hear how your background in technology shapes the conversations you have with your humanities colleagues, and perhaps how your background in the humanities and comparative literature and narrative has on the conversations that you may have with scientific colleagues. So, I mean, for example, into my mind, stories are what we use to map the world around us. So I would think
Right.
that interesting conversations to be had with neuroscientists, for example. Is that the kind of thing that happens? And what's your personal experience of that at Columbia?
No, so I find we have, for example, a really exciting working group here called Narrative. It's the Narrative Workshop, which is run out of Department of Sociology. And so when they invited me there a few years ago, I think I was one of the first sort of literary theory person there, and they said, the coolest thing right now in sociology and in psychology, there was a bunch of people from psychology in that lab, and in political science is narrative. And I was like, narrative, that's, I mean, weirdly, in the field of literary studies, narrative is often perceived as kind of a slightly old-fashioned, kind of like 1970s type of engagement. But I really do think that, um, for us in that group, questions of storytelling, narrative, to what extent narrative plays a role in the human mind, to what extent, I mean, clearly in the marketplace, to what extent narrative plays a role in our political life. You can think of the various folk tale like or mythology like conspiracies that surround our political life. Like that's, the story of QAnon, the legend of QAnon, the legend of Q, right? Something like that. I mean, so right away you can see that something like narrative can ground a conversation that spans quite a number of different fields. So I've been finding places to have that conversation across disciplines, all over the place, in the university and without as well, kind of reaching out to. I have many other examples, but perhaps later they'll come up.
Interesting that you talk about how narrative is perceived from different angles, and you talked about the marketplace. We can think of marketing, of course, as
Mm,
a brief aside. You can think of marketing as a department in a business or organization like finance or HR.
yeah,
But you could also see it as a narrative-based discipline alongside other narrative-based disciplines such as psychology, anthropology, or history, for example. Um,
exactly. Yeah.
and my understanding of story is that, our brains likely evolved to enable movement with intentionality. Moving on purpose means you need to know where you've been, where you are, where you could get to. Cognition enables us to think of that as the past, present, the future. Language enables us to narrate that as the beginnings, middles, and ends of our stories. And whereas we can't out navigate a migratory bird or out sprint a
Mm.
jaguar, at least I couldn't, our ability to tell stories means we can navigate more imaginatively through life. And that's ultimately why we haven't just evolved like other species, but have also developed from generation to generation. So our sense here is that what you're onto with narrative is incredibly powerful. um, let's turn to your book, unless you want to rip apart anything that I've just
No,
said.
no, that was good.
But how did you come specifically to write the book Literary Theory for Robots, and what was your purpose in writing it?
Well, again, there's a very specific kind of academic, I was engaged in a particular um, sort of nerdy marginal thought, which later turned out to be, I think, more important. But what I was looking at is early 20th century, late 19th century, and I was looking at publication history, in particularly in Anglophone world, in the United States and the British Empire. And what I saw through, through the statistics of publishing, just basically the economics of publishing, you see that um, an author, an average in the 19th century, like an average 19th century writer, in their career writes 10, 12 novels. Like think about your Dickens or Dostoevsky. Really, 10, 12 novels is exceptional. It's considered super prolific. And then based on my calculations, by the 1920s or so, there are single authors who are writing not 12 novels per career, but 2, 3, 4,000 novels per their career. So they're individual authors who, in their literary output, exceed the output of England 100 years prior. In 100 years, something happens in the intellectual productivity of literary output that by orders of magnitude increases the ability of the average writer. And that was, initially it seemed to be kind of just I was like, that's strange. It's not the story I know, so the traditional literary historical, I have in my mind kind of through education, okay, 19th century, there was like romanticism, and then, there was like symbolism, and then the modernist came, and the modernists really wanted, there's a particular sort of story of writers and movements that we all know. But then that particular moment seemed to not fit well within that story. For example, I always thought that modernist writers like Woolf or Joyce, that they were kind of like anti they were anti-machine, they were anti-automation, they were it was still about like the singular genius that can, rise above the kind of the fray, right? And they viewed themselves in opposition to like the industrial manufacture of stuff. That's modernism. It's supposed to shock and awake you from kind of mindless mass consumerism that was just beginning to take hold. But what I was seeing in my research is the fact that you have many more authors who at the same time are just producing much more in terms of their literary output, and to do that they're using tools, they're automating parts of their production. So I began to think about intellectual, I mean writing specifically, but in general intellectual labor, not as just a product of genius. You go and you're like, you're a super smart writer, you're going to go and write, but really as a manufacturing process. It's a manufacturing process which, just like any other manufacturing process, whether it's the making of shoes or cars or everything, right? The spoons, I don't know. The story of industrialism is the story of industrial manufacture. We no longer make stuff by hand in a workshop. We now make it in the factory. And what you see in the early 20th century is the rise of the fiction factory. These are literal fiction factories that gave us pulp fiction. There's a book in English called The Fiction Factory that outlines kind of a story of one of these pulp fiction authors. And, I really knew I had the book together when I saw another book written in Russian at the same time in the 1920s by a Soviet author, also called The Fiction Factory. But the Soviets imagined the fiction factory in a centralized planning way. They're like, okay, the new author of the future will work in a factory, and there'll be all these people collecting information, and like the author engineer, author producer will sit there and collect all these stories and make stories for the proletariat. The Soviets imagine this, and then the Americans at the same time are also writing the fiction factory, but they're working. Think about like Nancy Drew, or I mean the various like syndicate written pulp fiction, westerns, sci-fi. It's really stuff that when you think about like serial television today, like Law and Order, 30 years of like a nice pulpy sort of detective story, that really is being produced collectively. It's a kind of cultural product that's being produced collectively. Part of it is automated, it's written in teams, and it's written with tools. And once that became clear in my head that there is a literary history that I know that is a history of individual authors, but there is a literary history that we don't really know very well, and that is the history of writing in teams, and the history of collective authorship, and the history of authorship with tools. All of a sudden, I'm like, aha, this is really a book about the tools that uh, help or participate in the manufacture of intellectual goods.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many themes there which I found fascinating, both listening to you now and reading the book. I mean, in terms of collective labor, I mean, any conversation is a collective act, isn't it? I mean, right now, I have no idea how my voice is somehow being collected as packets of information and ends up coming out of your headset or speakers.
Right.
I couldn't
Yes.
be Paul and you couldn't be Dennis if there hadn't been people who had attributed those stories to us at the time of our births and allowed us to grow into them.
Yeah.
We usually think of studying literature as studying the high end, but actually understanding the core of where something is going, where our stories is going, seems to be incredibly important. And you relate um, narrative to patterns of democracy and so on. Um, you can look at the top or you can look at bottom up. And it strikes me that what you're looking at is really quite fundamental in terms of the kinds of culture that we have that will lead to the kind of leaders that we get, the kind of lives we lead, and so on. And there's a lot of philosophical questions looking at the history of how machines have generated text. Questions that arise today. If something can predict, if something can create a story, does that mean it's
Right.
alive? Does
Right.
that mean there's a
Yeah.
ghost in the machine? One thing
Yeah.
that interested me is you talk about the distinction between two types of intelligence. Intelligence is the outcome of knowledge, the thing that gets known, and intelligence as the human capacity to know. Now, AI is going to lead, as you've talked about, increasing the volume of output. We're going to have a lot more information, that sense of intelligence. To what degree is our capacity to know going to go up or down? Is the quality of our narrative going to improve and lead to healthier outcomes, or is it going to
Yeah.
degenerate?
Well, I think a key here is the usage of pronouns. So it's the we and the I. So you're asking like, do we become better authors? Do we know things? And know that this is like a very contentious. It's a confusing idea, right? Is that so? For example, because English is not my first language, I am not a great speller. So I don't like naturally. I will make many mistakes in English. So how do I write? I try. How do I write with less spelling mistakes? Well, I reach for a dictionary. So a dictionary, in a way, so me plus the dictionary, right, is makes kind of a system that together we sort of spell much better than I do on my own. And if I have to wonder now, okay, but who made this dictionary? Okay, this dictionary is whatever, like Mr. Webster made it, several centuries ago, and there was a bunch of lexicographers who made that dictionary more complete. And really, so when I'm writing, whatever my natural capacities for spelling are now like I imagine like a crowd, here's Mr. Webster behind me, here's like his helpers, and they're sort of like holding my hand, they're helping me, and they make me look better. They make me look better in front of my, when I write an email, I don't sound like a uneducated person, but it wasn't just me. That capacity for spelling was a little bit of myself and a lot of Webster and team. So now, when we look, so let's go one step further. Now, that ability to spell better, there's a squiggly line in your email, right? So now I don't have to go to the bookshelf even. It's just the dictionary is now piped directly into my writing tools, right? So now I'm being helped by Mr. Webster and team. There's a bunch of Microsoft people and a bunch of Google people and whoever. There is now engineers also basically working together I'm just writing a message saying like, I can't make this meeting. Please reschedule for 12 o'clock. But in that one moment, I was helped by a team of dozens and probably hundreds of people. And all of them made me kind of a little bit smarter. They made me spell better. They made me, and the sentence was completed. The sentence was, I wrote that email slightly faster and it was of higher quality. So we have to acknowledge the fact that the end result of that collaborative effort was the increase of what I can do personally. It increases my intelligence, has all of these sort of shared social technological components, right? And that means, the rising tide lifts all boats. All of us. I mean, I think today we receive slightly better formed emails because they were like spell checking is now built in. All the people who are too lazy to go to the bookshelf before, they just get the automated spelling correction, and sort of we all on average have gotten slightly more literate, right? So that's the particular thing I'm trying to capture in this book and really in all of my research is you take a ordinary moment of, it's a simple cognitive task, spell a word, write a sentence. But then when you actually look at how we do it today, you'll see that when you unpack that moment, you see that there are teams, there are other people, there are tools, there are dictionaries, there are all sort of tools, technologies, and social forces that together create this thing we called the intellect.
Yeah. I mean, your vision is so reassuring, and it builds a sense of how we can enhance our own agency with AI. Um, there's a concern that it awakens in me, a sort of
Yes.
countervailing concern, which is that um, that notion of enhancing our agency is also contrasted by the idea that, AI in practice so far is being developed in the hands of powerful vested interests. You have an individual like Elon Musk who's capable of
Mm.
holding democratic governments around the world more or less to ransom.
Yes.
It, it's not inevitable, is it, that AI will continue to actually enhance our agency? In some ways, our agency might be undermined by power imbalances that are stripping
Yes.
more and more influence away from us.
Yes. Okay, so a few things to say here. So first, note that I'm quite resistant, and maybe that's another punchline of the book, is to say that AI is doing things. One of the punchlines of the book was to say that artificial intelligence is really social intelligence because so it's such a complicated sense of collaboration that we just say, the AI wrote this, or like, who corrected my email? Oh, it was, Google, whatever, Gemini, whatever, it was the AI that did it. But really, when pressed, and, we are as scholars, like I feel the need to be pressed. Once you unpack, you're like, okay, it wasn't AI. It was actually a bunch of engineers. It was Webster. It's the whole kind of team that we conjure up behind that simple task. So I think that part is reassuring. Once you start sort of ceding agency to a tool, to a machine, to code, and you say, behind it is a complex network of um, social, economic, and you're right, corporate collaboration. I mean, I think, but that problem to me is, I mean, the fact that large entities, whether they're large corporations or large governments, are somehow mess with our own sense of agency. And I feel very small. I mean, forget like, I feel very small in comparison to Google or Microsoft or even, I don't know, the New York City mayor. I don't know. All of this stuff seems so much more intractable and so much big. I feel powerless. We're kind of back in like Kafka's land. Like, I feel powerless in front of large bureaucracies, right? Something like that. And obviously, like, the weapons they wield and the technology they wield are well beyond what I can afford or, I'm afforded to. So but that's a problem of modernity, right? Like, problem of living in a very complicated technological society where a lot of the political social actors are like, they're transhuman. They represent, I mean, that's what literally a corporation is. It's an incorporation of many people, buildings, and tools that then end up being, then we say, Microsoft decided to do this. Google decided to build, like, as if this incorporation, I mean, it's the Hobbesian Leviathan, as if this Leviathan has a will of its own. And that is a difficult, I'm not like super hopeful about that, but point is, it's a distinct problem. We should recognize within AI the good old familiar though intractable problem of modern politics. So that's sort of the message I'd like to bring.
Yeah. I couldn't resist the opportunity to involve AI in our conversation.
Of course, yeah.
And so and Anna's going to pop this in the chat for everyone, but I thought I would ask Chat GPT-4 to send me a summary of the sequel, the, of course, non-existent sequel, or yet to exist sequel to a literary theory for robots. So I posted the chat prompt. Please write the summary of a sequel to Literary Theory for Robots by Dennis Yi Tenen. People can read it in the chat. We will put it in the show notes for people who listen afterwards. And I wonder if, I have to say, for me as a reader, when I read it, I thought, hang on, I better just check that there isn't a sequel, that this isn't picking up on something that's actually either been written or is in production. So, but does it bring to life this artificially generated summary of a non-existent sequel to your book? Does it bring to life any of the themes that
Right.
you've been
So,
working?
yeah, it writes at the end. I'm looking at what you sent me. It says, Tenen concludes with a call to action urging scholars, engineers, and policymakers to collaborate on ethical frameworks that prioritize inclusivity, accountability, and humanity in the age of intelligent systems. And so no, that doesn't sound like the book I would write. And I'll tell you why. It does relate to kind of a part of your previous question. Is that if you follow me, if you agree with me that artificial intelligence is really social intelligence. So when I speak, when you speak to an AI, you essentially speak with general intelligence. And there is a sense in which in the technology investing circles, there's like this dream of artificial general intelligence. Like it's going to be the algorithm that can, it's the God formula. It will figure everything out. It's a machine capable of reasoning about everything. But if you believe, as I do, that this intelligence is social, it means you're conversing with an average intelligence. So we're back to this. And by the way, just today I was teaching and reading Descartes with my students. And Descartes in his method writes exactly about this, is that so weirdly, like the average the crowd, the average scientist is smarter than me. I don't know how far the moon is. I don't know how big the electron is. Like I know somebody figured this out. So on average, people are sort of smarter than me. The crowd in many ways is smarter than me. But in my area of expertise, I hope I'm slightly smarter than the crowd, right? So this is kind of the tension in Descartes, is to say that we enter this pool of collective intelligence, and it rises all of us. We know, we're back to this, like we know something better together. But then in this case, what I see from AI is, this is like a very general. There are many books like this. There are many books that urge a call to action, that prioritize accountability and inclusivity, and that all sounds like a generic book about AI, which is par for the course, because that's what an average person, average scholar would write about this topic. And I hope that in my expertise, I can do slightly better than that. I do want to finish. It's again to return to your past question. If this, AI is social and it's general in that sense, it also means it's not really like you can't really build a moat around it in a corporate sense. If what AI is basically a way to interact with our collective sense of like general knowledge, you're basically asking, you're asking science. You're like, how far away is the moon? None of that is a proprietary. That's not proprietary. General intelligence cannot be trademarked. It cannot be, so maybe the tools right now, you see like a temporary market advantage where, now only a large corporation can train LLM, has the computational power to like access the general pool of knowledge. But the pool of knowledge, the immense, vast pool of knowledge, is clearly in the public domain. And various will be able to reach into it with various tools and various sort of appendages. There's no way, I think, to keep it within single corporate hands. There's no way to build a fence around it and then charge for access. So I'm sorry, I return to the previous question, because I think it relates to this tension between what I know and what we know. And this particular quote of a potential book, I think I would do better. I hope.
Essentially, you'd be the task would be to be better at being you than AI could be you, and I think you would do better.
Well, right. It's better to be me than the crowd than the crowd. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? The fact that you're conversing with the average, it's a statistically average thing that somebody who's like me would say. But and probably, all of us are kind of, I mean, that's what Descartes writes about, is, all of us are some combination of like, here's what I am special in this way. I hope all of us feel somewhat special. But then we're also kind of a collection of averages. Like I'm an average cook. I'm an average, mathematician. We're average in majority of things. And we have to also acknowledge that, like, that's great, because, being average at math is amazing. Like that's a great, or, for a non-mathematician, like being average at, being an average cook is pretty good. It's better than being a bad cook.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's true that in my case in particular, I would definitely bet on AI rather than on myself when it came to mathematics.
Yeah,
Um,
when it comes to some things, yeah. So it's this, yeah, conversation. I mean, I love this, the conversation with the crowd, and in fact, that's maybe it's how I would use AI quite a bit. It's a really good weather vane of like what is generally the outlook, about something, and that it does very well summarizing.
There was some research that was covered in the Financial Times today that
Mm,
maybe today or yesterday, I believe, that was saying that when AI writes poetry as if in the voice of Shakespeare, others,
yeah.
that it started to be that readers are preferring the fake to the real. But I hope that I, I'm kind of with you because your description of the sort of uncontainability of collective knowledge and that can resist some of the, overcome some of the challenges we face today really does inspire me because there's a lot of reasons to be worried that the opposite might be the case. And it actually,
Mm,
you reminded me of a line. It's been a long time since I've read anything on literary theory other than literary theory for robots. But I remember there's a book on literary theory by Terry Eagleton,
mm,
and at the end, he talks about narrative and versus criticism, and he says, at the end of in an old-fashioned lion taming act, um, the lion is more powerful than the tamer. The tamer knows this, the audience knows this. The problem for the lion is that the lion doesn't know this, but perhaps now is the time for the lion to awaken. And I think that you're right that, we all have greater and greater access to intelligence. So we do have the capacity to go beyond and to be the source of harnessing it in the right ways. Some of that, of course, is through the day job. And one comment you make in the book, you write that in the future, markets may require fewer doctors or software engineers, but those that remain will also find their work enriched. And I wonder if you might sort of unpack
mm.
that, and maybe if you can apply it to the world of marketing and the creative industries, where may there be a
Right.
need for fewer of us, and where does it nevertheless leave those who are working in those fields with a more enriched experience?
Right. So, one way we can look at the development of photography, for example, I think is quite instructive, is that, early on when basically cell phones began to rival in power some of the older technologies in photography. And there was a lot of worry from photographers that their profession is going to disappear and that the creativity of photography is going to somehow disappear because now everybody is a photographer. And maybe up until the 1990s, you can be like a wedding photographer or you could be like a advertising professional and just you take some photos. Your tools are fairly, you're a very good photographer, and then you do some light graphic design and that's enough for a career. Today, a photographer is much more than just somebody who presses the shutter button. They are they are working with very complicated tools. Um, they're working with drones. They're being like movie producers. So what like the capability of an average photographer today is incredible. They're making shots. Like remember when Lord of the Rings came out and there were these shots from a helicopter? People were like, "Wow, mountains from far away." Now you watch a YouTube video of like a teenager and they're able to replicate that kind of shot that's just normal. But that also means that now did did the profession of being a graphic designer or a photographer transform? Of course. It now takes way more training. And a lot of photographers, I would assume, lost their jobs. But graphic design in advertising is doing better than ever, and the quality is better than ever. It's just now you are an artist, you're an engineer, you're using tools, you're using AI tools, you're coding stuff, you're operating drones, right? And also note that um, the kind of photographers that operate in traditional media, film photographer, also a talented film photographer is well prized today because in that sea of sort of technologically enabled people who are all using the same tools, who all kind of create more or less the same look, being unusual, being talented in that field also becomes actually much more valuable. And we can extend the same insight to writing and to other fields, other intellectual fields. So being a writer, it also means just being a writer in your study. You're just there in your notebook and a pen. okay, now everybody can be a writer. Everybody. It's like maybe at one time being the most literate person in your village. You could sort of charge people to sign their names, and that was enough. But now everybody can sign their name. Everybody can spell a sentence. Everybody can put together a decent average paragraph about, a decent average book proposal or a grant proposal or a decent advertising campaign. But to rise above, we have to both become you have to become an expert in using that technology the way everybody else does. And some people are better at it than others. And on top of that, you have to bring your own talent and your own, talent becomes even more valuable in the conditions of technological saturation. So therefore, I'm kind of hopeful in the end. We didn't see the cratering of photography or graphic design with AI. We didn't see the cratering. Another good example is chess. When Deep Blue won against Kasparov, people thought that's it, chess is over. Chess is doing better than ever today. There's more young people interested in chess. There's more YouTubers because it goes back to human stories and the drama and people accusing each other. And all in the background, there's like even ever smarter machines. But that's not the point. We're not playing against machines. We love kind of messing with each other anyway. Like that's what we can go back, to like thinking about weddings. Like the wedding is the interesting part, it turns out, not the photography. It's still about human stories, and it's still about how we enjoy to spend time with each other.
Yeah.
It's still a social thing, despite the fact that there's these very smart tools that can do it better somehow.
Yeah, it kind of reinforces and gives extra agency to humanity. I talked earlier about stories having evolved from our need to move from one place to another, and I
Yeah,
guess that the human component to any narrative is that intentionality, that direction. In that AI doesn't doesn't feel better at the end of the story. If you have the human, say the famous six-word human story, for sale, baby shoes never worn. I wonder
right.
whether it has the same impact if it turned out that it just happened as a fluke to come out of a random word generator, whether
Yeah.
it have the same emotive
But
impact.
that's the example you give is, I mean, isn't that a machine in itself? So the fact that there's like a formula and to say for sale, baby shoes never worn, and so that's a template. And the fact that, stories operate by templates, and let's acknowledge the fact that the great writing often works by template, which are they're canned responses, they're automated in some ways, but that doesn't make them less human somehow, because part of our humanity actually lies in sort of deriving these patterns, externalizing them, and then letting them run amok in some ways in our cultural sphere, cultural political sphere.
Yeah, it was interesting actually. The word template comes up a lot in your book, and I
Yeah.
was waiting to see whether it was going to be related to the notion of genre. And it wasn't explicitly so in the book, but I kind of imagine that genre is an example of template.
Genre is a good example, though again, it's a little harder. I think literature and really intellectual work is harder. It's easier to conceive of these templates in manual work. So, for example, if you think about the history of architecture and the history of construction, so
Mm.
like clearly, if somebody is building a bridge, you don't want them to improvise. You want them like just use the most, like whatever is the best way to build bridge, please do that before you do any sort of. And when you build a building, engineers are not rediscovering sort of like how to build most of them don't. They use prefabricated components, prefabricated screws, prefabricated walls, prefabricated windows, right? We kind of part of manual manufacture today is using prefabricated components. The argument I'm trying to present in the book is to say, now think of prefabricated intellectual components. So that's a template is a prefabricated thought that we can then use. And that it's a prefabricated thought. It means you have to put less effort into building, let's say, like a episode of Law and Order. Some parts you can kind of yank off a shelf. You have to dress it up. You still have to change it a little bit, just like, buildings look different in some ways. But you're right. Your question was really smart in terms of the genre. Is you look back, you look back at construction and you look, hey, all the buildings in the 1990s have this kind of look to them because they're kind of using the same components. And all the cars from the 2000s, they all kind of look the same. And then you can see that, and then 10 years later, they all look slightly different. You can see that there's movements because the underlying technologies and the templates and the prefabricated components, they kind of move in unison. And in retrospect, we say that was a genre. And I would like to make the same analogy to say that in retrospect, when we look at the history of literature or the history of painting or the history of photography, some of the changes that we see in aggregate, they're due to this like changing underlying technological commercial capabilities of the tools, right?
Yeah. Um, Speaking of social intelligence, which is such a theme in everything that you've said in your book, just to remind people to start warming up your digital hands for anyone who'd like to put questions to Dennis. I have a couple more, one or two more, see we go. But as people raise their hands, we'll start to filter in those questions. But one thing I did want to raise is a somewhat serious point. Towards the end of the book, Dennis, you refer to some volunteering work that you did on the intersection of technology, narrative, and conflict in support of Ukraine earlier in the war. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and what perspective it gave you
Mm,
on the situation. I had a war correspondent recently making the obvious point that all battles are ultimately battles of narrative.
yes.
Any perspective it might have given you on the future of cognitive warfare, hybrid warfare, how AI stories and conversations shape
Mm,
societies at their most challenging
yeah.
moments.
So, so far I've been pretty optimistic, but I think I do have kind of a source of concern, and I think it's important that we are concerned about the right thing. So I'm less concerned about kind of existential threat of AI. However, when it comes to warfare, it becomes much more clear that a very purposeful employment of automated agents and their injection into our social and political sphere, it does something to our collective consciousness, to our collective, like what we feel about, let's say, the war, what we feel about the economy. I mean, this is we're back to marketing, we're back to advertising. Is that there's something about both the scale of social networks and then the ability of automated agents to inject stories and to support certain sort of narratives and sustain them and push them over other narratives. I think we're only beginning to deal with the consequences of this increased. But note, it's not because machines are taking over or something like that. Are now, we have an increased capacity for social thought. That means like there's more crowd thinking, right? AI and our connectivity means we move now in greater unison. A piece of news, somewhere far away reaches us much quicker now. When there's conflict, when there's stories, you can now observe a missile strike in real time. But that capacity for coordination means also the capacity for miscoordination and misinformation. It means that now this body, this political body, is now also can be sort of programmed socially and through narrative and through stories. Stories can be injected. They're actors, they're automated actors, they're state actors that are now injecting themselves into, you know, I'm sending a message to my grandma on Facebook, but somehow that message must pass through the complexity of the political structure, right? And you can imagine, for example, communicating with colleagues in places like Ukraine or in Syria or whatever, various affected. I mean, the events in Korea yesterday. I mean, you can see how even in our most private sort of conversations, all of a sudden we have to contend with these political and social and automated kind of storytellers and actors. And that is now, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with our increased capacity for synchronization? How do we deal with our increased sort of susceptibility to crowd dynamics and crowd delusion? That's the real question. But again, it's not necessarily a new question, right? Like we should, so once we see the crowd within AI, we can sort of go back to like, oh, crowds can be great, can be really scary, actually, right? The way crowd dynamics can be quite, and that part really worries me when I see kind of mass synchronized movement toward things that don't make any sense.
Mm.
And then thinking, but again, my impulse as a scholar is to pause and to start teasing things out, right? It looks like, just like the sentence, the spell correction looks like one thing, you start teasing out, all of a sudden a complicated picture emerges. When you look at certain stories about war, for example, and you can start looking at how specific intelligence agencies are using the tools of mass communication
Mm.
to drive a narrative. And that's something, at the very least, it deserves. I mean, this is where I, as a literary scholar, as a person who's interested in studying storytelling, I can contribute to the war effort in a very specific way, through kind of the power of storytelling.
Yeah. There is a notion in psychology that I don't think it's used that much, a notion of narrative competence.
Mm,
And from what I understand, I think it's often used, for example, in child development. It's not how good a story can you tell, it's the quality of your narrative understanding. So
mm,
go to your friend's birthday party, do you understand that it's their birthday? So you're generally quite nice to them.
yeah,
They will probably be the center of attention at that in that moment. Can you think of ideas that work in that context? And my concern is with the proliferation of misinformation and the fact that misinformation can be cheaper and easier to produce and
mm,
replicate and scale than real insight and valuable knowledge. That the big risk facing us could be a sort of degradation of our societal narrative competence. Look at our big problems, from the climate emergency to migration. They're all things that can be solved with the right narrative competence, in ways that we come out of those problems better off rather than worse off. And I do fear that with the speed of artificial intelligence, we've responded quite slowly to the climate emergency, and we've had many decades to do that. We
right.
may not have decades to respond to an AI fueled emergency.
Yeah. I mean, I guess so, but I wanna go back to being slightly hopeful. That's the pro so if you think about, that's the problem with technology in general, right? So for example, we invent the car and it seems great, like now we can drive places and you seem more independent, but then in general, cars have, they have reshaped our cities and maybe they have done something to our environment. And point is, technology, that kind of collective processing about what technology does and how to optimize it for the goods that we believe in, for the ideals. How do you make not just how do you drive faster and more and have better roads, but how do you have a more livable city? You're back into that kind of values-based humanities thinking. Once you figure out the engineering part, we can now go faster. Okay, but why? Where are we going? Why should we? How does this? But that kind of reckoning, collective intelligence moves slowly, right? We haven't yet figured out how to live nicely with cars, right? We are constantly sort of adjusting that balance, and I think AI is the same. I mean, intellectual tools, okay, so now you can write faster, you can get that paragraph out. I mean, there is, low hanging fruit that are just have to do with quantity and efficiency. And then we are getting into, okay, but it has all these unintended side effects on our, political life, let's say. And then we're going to try to legislate and we're going to try to change and out engineer. But the problem, I think, what you're outlining is that this slow social brain, can it sort of reason fast enough to, like, before it sort of, like, maybe some technologies are just going to be so destructive that we don't have time. Maybe, though, I don't know. I mean that does happen. Technological disruption sometimes does lead to, like, the fall of empires or something. But in general, it's a problem of technology. Technology is great, but also it can have horrible effects, and we need to it just means that we need to be more reasoned about it. We need to have a conversation. It's kind of all the good stuff, right? There's a way in which we can discuss how to live with technology in a way that aligns. That's the alignment problem. Technically, it's called. How does technology align with the stuff that we want to do? But note, by the way, it's not the real problem is how do we even agree on what we want to do? I mean, this is like, look at again, cars is just an easy example. Some people want to have a large polluting truck. They love to have a truck that like spews out black smoke and they want more roads and other people don't. It's not a problem of cars. It's the problem is how do you talk to your fellow people, fellow citizens, and agree on like, is it more important to have the environment or is it more important to have good economy? That agreement is not it's not a technological problem. It's just the problem of finding agreement with humans.
Yeah. Which brings us back to the humanities and narratives that enable better types of cooperation. It looks like
Yeah.
Anna has her hand raised.
Ahead of this discussion, I was listening to some of your other interviews and heard you speak about the danger of thinking about AI as a single thing. And I
Yes.
just hoped that you could comment on that more.
Yeah, so I already brought this up. I really I'm annoyed with this personification. Well, it's not even annoyed. I'm fascinated by it as well. But we tend to put AI into like we think we think of it as like a kind of a bearded man. It's kind of a godlike character, and then you can see it, when you do kind of language analysis and the way people talk about AI, they will put AI in the subject of the sentence. AI did this, AI is smart, AI, as if it's one thing. Uh, I mean, clearly, the number of tools. So if you look at the kind of tools involved in, go to Google Docs and start writing, there'll be like, dozens and dozens of diverse technologies that are kind of enabling that to happen. They're all quite different. And of course, it's easier at times to say, okay, you know, AI wrote this. But did it really, really what it's just like it's easier to say, okay, Microsoft decided to sell its stock or whatever. Okay, but Microsoft doesn't decide. Okay, really what you're saying is that there was a meeting and there was 10, 100 people and they voted and then so we take the complexity and we sort of package it into like a picture of a human because it's easier than to discuss it. But it also means the seeding of agency here, where we all of a sudden, and then we feel powerless. We're like, oh my God, this thing seems so powerful. But it's only powerful because it's powerful in language. It's only powerful because we keep metaphorically making it into this like boogeyman. Whereas really we should be seeing it as this like complicated, unwieldy, I mean, it has all sorts of problems, but they're not problems of like an evil, it's not going to be like a little evil person who is like trying to ruin us. It's more like it's a huge, complicated system with unintended effects. And how do we sort of bring it, how do we align it? How do we kind of prune it? How do we try to so that's, it's really like there is a level at which just metaphorically we can do better. And when I see in print, AI did this, AI is going to, I'm like, I don't even understand, what exactly are you talking about? It's a bunch of related technologies through, involving hundreds of corporations and companies and patents and language models, right? It's all of that complexity. Then we put it behind a screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It raises a lot of thoughts in my mind because I sort of I'm in all honesty I'm completely with you, and I think that when we unpack the particulars of what's behind AI, it's much more meaningful in each individual instance. At the same time, we like to see the wood for the cheese, and thinking of AI as a thing puts it in a sort of salient enough place for people to really take on board. How do you contend with AI? And I guess in a sense you can break anything down to particulars, even an individual person. If I do something, who is doing something? If my hand does something, if it's my hand, is my hand different to me? And we were all
Right,
a
right.
collection of modular parts biologically. There isn't a
Yeah.
separate ghost to the machine that we can step out of.
Well, that's why we shouldn't be lost in the metaphysical. I think often the metaphysical anxiety, yeah, I don't find it, yes, we can contemplate the question, like, to what extent am I even a single individual, stuff like that. But, so note how often the existential conversation, it kind of occludes the politics. So let's think of an example, like self-driving cars. So the fact that really the promise of self-driving cars and what was it, like hyperloop and all that stuff. I mean, there's all this like technological sort of mythification of technology, but really the history of self-driving cars is also like it's just an end run around around labor laws, right? Or it's an end run around being able to employ drivers for like without paying them a minimum wage. But instead of saying that, we said, no, technology enabled car that will, it's kind of there's a lot of hand waving, but behind it is kind of the familiar greed and an attempt to sort of, right? We all agreed, like, what the I don't know legislation around like I don't know Airbnb or something. Like we got together with neighbors and said, look, if everybody is going to sublet here, it's going to be like too much partying, and let's like have some rules. And then somebody else says, no, 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 let's those rules are too restrictive. Can I kind of somehow I want to get around the social political consensus and pose the question technologically in a way that it seems inevitable and it seems existential and it's all, but really what they're doing is a political sort of undermining of existing political customs. And I think that's what we need to call out. We need to say, okay, you're showing us the boogeyman, but really, okay, aren't we just talking about like not paying a minimum wage? And let's have, and it's not that that's a discussion, that's an easy discussion. I don't even, I don't even purport to have like it's complicated. I don't know if there is wide agreement on some of these social issues, but that's a good point is let's have the right conversation instead of talking about whether self-driving cars are going to like kill us or something, or like it's going to rise up of the machines. Let's talk about to what extent we want drivers to have minimum wage or whatever, or how our data is being used for training. Well, the specific questions are in a way more difficult, but they're also more familiar because they have to do with just again, we're back to how do we relate to each other in some kind of civil and civic way.
I have one question, and then I saw Mark had posted in the chat. So if you're willing, Mark, you could come on after this and put your question directly. But Dennis, you mentioned that you hadn't always lived in the US. All the big trillion-dollar tech businesses are in the US. If we come down a tier to the sort of hundreds of billions of dollars of businesses, a disproportionate number of those are
Mm,
also in the US. A lot of brilliant early work was done, DeepMind, for example, in the UK. But
mm,
what can we do in Europe to catch up? I mean, the tech is playing such a vibrant part of the US economy.
right.
It is increasingly important to our futures in both in terms of prosperity and in terms of safety. What kind of things do you think that we need to do in Europe to get back on the front foot with these kind
Yeah.
of technologies?
Well, again, to follow my previous analogy, I mean, you can look at the history of um, ride sharing services in Europe, and you can see that some countries where Europe sometimes is more successful in openly finding that balance between regulation and innovation. And so you see that in ride-sharing services where, they have not allowed the big corporate players, the big American corporate players to disrupt their local, whatever, cab driving culture. Similarly, you look at various consortia around libraries and archives and national traditions, where often, so I know there is a large, for example, Nordic consortium, with Sweden, Norway, and Denmark and Finland sometimes. But the point is, there's like this thinking about like, if we're going to train models, let's make sure that our languages are not being completely clobbered by the English dominance, and that this information, the training, again, if you kind of recognize that the library and the archive is that pool from which we draw wisdom, and it's the pool in which the machines are training. Well, that also means that it's valuable. It needs to be protected, and we need to insist that this knowledge remains in the public domain. And I sometimes think that the notions, the policy around public domain in general is sometimes stronger in Europe, and there's like a longer tradition in preserving, like, sorry, I'm kind of like, the Ramblers, the rambling tradition in the UK, where like there's the right of way through private property, and like you just like have to walk it once in a while to make sure it remains the right of way, sort of. And there's a group of ramblers. They're like elderly hikers, maybe not so elderly, who just like go and walk, and they take a note. We've been here. We kept this path open to the public. We need to do that for intellectual domain, and I often look to Europe and to some of the existing traditions. So like intellectual rambling. Let's make sure, of course, there's corporate interests, and often American corporate interests, that want to build a paywall around, I don't know, Norwegian folktales, but we shouldn't allow that. We should make sure that that collective intelligence, collective wisdom, collective mythology remains in the public domain. And one of the main sort of the people who think about this a lot are librarians. And Europeans have a long-standing history of archivism and librarianship that I think will ultimately, end up being a leader in this space, because they're the repository of training data in specific languages.
Yeah, ultimately there needs to be a different type of an alignment between innovation and public interest, and having that public access. I love the
Right.
analogy of the Ramblers. I wonder, Mark, do you fancy putting your question directly?
Yes, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Dennis. Yeah, it was just my point really, because I was fascinated by your thoughts at the beginning of your piece when you were talking about writing and the manufacturing process, and obviously we focused on the positive aspects of using these tools to enhance creativity. One of the things that I'd be interested to hear from you is about how do we manage the flip side of that, because almost it's about commoditizing in terms of a drive for efficiency that the AI could potentially give. Isn't there a danger that we're going to then commoditize the outputs of that whole creative process? And what's the benefit of that? Because as a creator, part of the fulfillment of that creative process, the experience, is actually going on that journey. And so therefore the output of what you produce isn't just the physical final iteration, but it's the journey of discovery and the learnings that come with it.
Yeah.
And I ask this question because I've seen, as many of us on this call have, the evolution of social media platforms, and obviously the people that were involved in building that, and the ethics that sat around it were very positive, and there to enhance and open up this sort of whole interaction from a community point of view.
Yeah.
But obviously we've seen over the past decade how that's flipped, and then and society is having to reel and deal with the toxicity that comes out of the social platforms and the social landscape. So I'm just superimposing this on the fact that we're grappling with what AI can bring to the party, but it's about, I think that if we're at this stage, we need to then consider what the flip side is. How do we actually try and manage that, or try and ensure that that isn't going to compromise our journey to a sort of greater fulfillment and enlightenment in this space?
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. I think there are several good points that are quite important to the discussion. But let me say again, allow me an analogy. So the fact that the greater sort of mobility that the cars bring to our culture, right? The downside of that is we move less, right? As humans. So now we have like epidemic of obesity, partly because we don't have to do hard labor. And so we are not moving enough to burn the calories that we eat. And so what do? We go to the gym, right? And kind of the idea there is that, so if you told me I'm going to the gym, but like I sit down on a bike, but then I hook up a machine to it and then it pedals for me, you'll say like, well, you're missing the point of the gym, right? That's not the fact that the machine can pedal for you. You're kind of your body needs to go through the experience of exercise to derive the benefits. Let's extend this to intellectual things. So it may be to intellectual capacities. It may be that, in the short, I mean, maybe we're already there, where people our students are not able to spell without a spell check. They're not able to reckon or calculate things without a calculator. And so what do? We need to get to the mental gym. We need to make sure that our children and we ourselves as adults continue to exercise our body and our mind, it turns out. Just the body was more obvious. So now, and you need to go to the gym and do simple math problems and write creatively just to maintain the capacity, right? So it's a problem. It's both. It's liberation, mobility liberation, intellectual liberation. I can now write with greater precision, or greater, not precision. I can appear more smart in my emails, but then now I'm really forgetting how to spell. But look, I mean, fitness culture is doing well. Gyms. This is partly why the gym culture is so, and I suspect we'll have. There is going to be actually more interest in sort of like bespoke mental activity, let's put it this way, unaided, like let's get together and do theater and write and just do stuff that, yes, machines can do it, or play chess. Yes, machines can play it, but you're missing the point if you think playing is a good example here, because you can't have the machine play for you. Right? It doesn't, that's not why we play with each other. We play because it's fun and because it's healthy for you. And it's, you're spending time outside. So anyway, I in a way, I'm just agreeing with you, and I'm just looking for analogies to see how we managed to make it this far. How did we manage to survive other similar sort of technological changes in our life, in our natural changes that seem to fundamentally transform, that relationship between natural capacities, what my body can do, and sort of what the machine can do in my stead.
We're coming to the end of the time we'd booked with you, Dennis. Is it okay if we take one last question?
We can take.
Neil, as it happens by coincidence, in sort of a former life, was a borderline professional standard of cyclists.
There you go.
Nice continuity there.
We could talk about doping, mechanical doping in cycling, where you put a little motor inside of your handlebars or whatever.
I spent a lot of time on Zwift, but anyway. No, fantastic talk. Thanks, Dennis. My question is around, and I think you just set it up, what is intrinsically human? You mentioned about going to the gym and us driving cars. Well, there's a lot of connected issues there, because we're reasoning with that. It's possibly ultra-processed food, the fact that we live in different... So there are many things that we have designed a world that we as people are not necessarily well equipped for genetically. I think with storytelling, I want to ask the question about, I guess, ownership of that word. Is a story not something that a person tells to another person in order to, I guess, as cavemen, we did it to help us keep alive, because we didn't have time to take up, narrative like storytelling. But we need to do that because we're people of community. We have experiences. You told yourself there's how your perspective has been created from where you've come from, your language, your experience of the world, which has made your perspective unique. I don't feel, I think we should take the word of storytelling away from AI, because I believe that's something that starts with a person and ends with a person. And if you get AI to write stories, use the analogy of just look at what Disney have done to Star Wars when you try and create Star Wars by committee, you get something that people
Right.
don't really like. it's
Yeah.
the number of averages. So anyway, I just explain how intrinsically I see AI as an opportunity to reset and be more human, rather than
Yeah.
to worry so much about what it will do and make us less human.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Look, it's that push and pull between natural capacities and augmented capacities, which are augmented socially and technologically, right? And it's both that augmented capacities, both, I mean, it's a good, it's something that but it's very human. We are unique in being, we can synchronize in a way no other animals, perhaps like ants, I don't know, but I think we're even better than ants. We're good at synchronizing this like massive projects, and one way we synchronize is with storytelling, with common narratives, common goals, philosophies. I mean, so that's so it's an age. The thing is, I slightly bristle against is this notion that like there is some natural state that we need to return to, because if you remember, there's a famous dialogue, Plato's Phaedrus, where a student of Socrates comes from lecture and says, I heard this cool lecture and all these cool ideas. And then Socrates says, no, you didn't hear anything. You're hiding behind, in your coat, you're hiding text. And instead of thinking about what it means, you just read it and you memorized it. And it's a whole story about how writing itself is going to ruin natural capacity of humans to remember anything. And in a way, that's true. The fact that we can, but do we want to go back? Does that mean we have to go back to a pre-illiterate, pre-writing society so we can be more natural? Or before that, language is a technology that enables that collaboration and that it enables us to articulate shared projects together. Should we go back to some pre-linguistic, primate-like condition? So the fact that we need to go backwards somehow to rediscover that pure, I'm really against this, like, let me just be human without any, well, no, there's no way. That our defining characteristic here is getting in trouble together. And we get in trouble together by like huddling and making plans and telling stories and using tools, right? Like that's what separates us. And yeah, that kind of activities also can lead to all sorts of, that's not always nice. Sometimes we build the Hoover Dam and we discover the electron, I know, and sometimes we go to war. Point is, social, again, I would go back to like crowd activity can be amazing, but there's nothing that it can also, that's war. It's a bunch of people grab clubs and go beat up some other people. I mean, it can be very, very scary. And so, as usual, the technology itself doesn't guarantee that it will be used in some ways that's healthy for us, as we see with other examples, cars or, but yet, we are able to, so that doesn't mean we should give up, right? I really think that we can imagine. I mean, I think the sport analogy here is great. Is that how do we, you see I really think we live in this like golden age of sport where more people are bicycling, more people are running. Sport is more accessible and people recognize the need for that self-cultivation. And I suspect very quickly we'll recognize the need for mental self-cultivation in a similar way. Yes, at work, I use a calculator, I use a AI-enabled email, but I'm also now recognizing, oh, I need to write more. I need to actually purposefully get to the mental gym every day to make sure that just I stay happy and healthy and productive for a long time.
Well, this has been such a wide-ranging and fascinating
Yes.
conversation.
Yeah.
It's completely
Wonderful questions too.
I've read your book twice and listened to it once, and after this conversation, it kind of makes me want to do it all over again. Yuval Noah Harari, I heard say yesterday that there have been two important moments in the history of the universe: the beginning of the evolution of organic life and the beginning of the evolution of inorganic life with AI. And he's, of course, the great historian of the narratives that drive our cooperation. And while we recognize the dangers that this can pose when it's AI enabled, your vision of rambling rights, your vision of collective intelligence, your vision of collective agency, even your vision of getting into, at least sometimes, hopefully, the right kinds of trouble together. Reminds me of, there was a formula created by the Harvard Divinity School of what makes a successful religion. They said three things. It's three Bs: a sense of the beyond, a sense of belonging, and a sense of becoming. And there is something in your notion of collective intelligence through which we can, in working with AI to achieve positive ends, be a part of something bigger than ourselves and that we couldn't have achieved alone. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone today, and everyone who will engage with the recording. A couple of brief notes for future gatherings. So our next Your Marketing Kind will be with Jonathan Gabay on creating brand trust in an AI world on December 11th. Our next xChange will be with Will Hutton, the rescheduled xChange on how we can remake Britain. And so that will now be on January 9th. The Prime Minister said he felt under pressure to live up to the contents of Will's book, and we'll be asking Will how he thinks Keir Starmer has been doing on so far. And in our next Coffee with a Cause, we'll be working together to develop the marketing strategy for the preventative health social enterprise appointment health on January 16th. So once again, thank you so much, Dennis, for your inspiring work and for sharing that inspiration with us directly today.
Thank you, Paul, and everybody else for coming.